moving on now. Our next presentation is titled On the Road to Easier Digital Score Acquisition. And presenting on this topic is Christy Berglund from the University of Minnesota. Here's the bio. Christy Berglund is music metadata librarian at the University of Minnesota, where she is responsible for cataloging music, ebooks, and streaming media, as well as supervising cataloging staff. Kristi has mentored students from local and regional library studies programs in both technical services and music-specific fieldwork. Kristi majored in music and math before studying music in Norway as a Fulbright scholar. Master's in DMA in vocal performance and pedagogy from the University of Minnesota, MLIS from UW Wisconsin-Milwaukee, is currently president of OLAC Catalogers Network and sings professionally. Potentially fun facts: Kristi enjoys woodworking, gardening, and collecting rocks. So Kristi, please take it away. Thanks.
All right, so my questions are also, can you hear me and see my screen? Yep, okay, good. Alrighty then. So I want to make sure that we have a little time for questions if there are any. I know I still have plenty of questions, so I expect some of you may also. So I'm just going to try to whoosh on through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're approaching digital score acquisition at the University of Minnesota Libraries. So digital scores, the scope of what we're talking about and what we aren't talking about. The process I'm describing does not cover digital scores that might be available through larger, more established publishers like the Alexander Street Press models we were just talking about for audio. But we're talking about more standalone one-off things. We are also an Alma library, and in our current state, we are limited by not having a particularly functional way to host and circulate born digital materials, for which the University of Minnesota isn't the original publisher. Our awkward workaround is to process PDFs as if they were ILL materials, but that really offers no long-term solutions in terms of where the source files should live, and is arguably no different than just distributing copies of the files, and it's just not a particularly satisfying approach with respect to discovery. So we've been collecting digital scores for about 2 years now. We avoided it as long as we could just because of all of the issues with acquisition and hosting and to say nothing of cataloging. But when it could be avoided no longer, we reckoned we ought to start figuring this out. So a unique set of complications arise in the acquisition of digital scores, as they tend not to fall seamlessly into the established workflows of either electronic resources or physical printed scores. How they're different from ebooks. They're not quite ebooks. Ebooks have been around a long time, and the acquisition and cataloging processes are pretty well smoothed out. Ebooks are usually produced by publishing houses with their own hosting platform, standard licensing agreements. They're really familiar with the library model, and you know, that works well for us in that context. Ebooks resulting in this tend to be rather expensive, especially compared to the type of scores we're ordering, which are cheap for the most part. Ebooks are just that, electronic books, usually one single blob of beautifully formatted texts, no sets of parts or other icky little complications like that. At the same time, they are not quite physical scores. There are no approval plans, that we have at this point, or slips to order from. There are no bib records out there for the acquisitions folks to import and attach an order to, which is how we place orders in our system. That's how it has to be. So the acquisitions folks need to create a provisional record based on scant information available. And it's not uncommon for the title or composer information to be woefully incomplete, or, you know, when we get the item minutes later, you know, you really have to know what you're searching for because the file doesn't bear any resemblance to what was put in the record. And there may not be the same information on the zip folder, the file name, or on the music itself. It may not even have text. Digital score acquisition also has some big differences. Like Alexander Street Press, Music Online, Classical Scores, or Encoda. Here we're generally talking about individual one title at a time standalone purchases. No centralized hosting platform or other kind of interface. What you see is what you get, and sometimes not even that much. So in the beginning of this process, we were responding to patron needs. If they requested the score as a PDF, we tried to get them a digital copy. So we did that, and soon issues arose. What issues, you might ask? Well, basically it boils down to the fact that every party in this process is coming at this from a completely different perspective and kind of user needs, and the challenge is to bridge the knowledge gaps between them. Selectors hear about these resources from students and faculty, often composer colleagues at other institutions, which may be in other countries, or local composers or alumni composers. Composers, creative folks who almost certainly have at least one other job in addition to writing music, teachers, performers, librarians, the gamut, maybe running their own website. They are not thinking about the library model when they're putting their works out there. They're thinking about protecting and sharing their intellectual property and making money. They aren't necessarily in the United States, so consequently may have a lack of knowledge of U.S. copyright laws, as we may have a lack of knowledge of foreign copyright laws. At the same time, it's easier to access scores from foreign composers because of the internet, but complications arise in negotiations, language issues, especially legal language that can be complicated enough when you're not trying to translate it, but there are all kinds of opportunities for complications and confusion. Vendor producers could be big or little, probably don't have a lot of experience dealing with libraries and tend not to understand our needs. The most common business model that I have come across is producers that are selling multiple copies or licenses to schools and ensembles. And their understanding of licensing, copyright, performance rights, all kind of blur together. So their licensing language, if there is any, tends to center around performance rights and minimizing loss of revenue from illegal copying, which completely makes sense. One example is a score, sold to Grace Lilliard, our acquisitions person, at the bottom of the first page of the score. I totally understand why they put that there, but we're not circulating that with somebody's name on it. File issues and file names issues. We have an example of the Assad Piazzolla 2 songs. That sounds great if you're, just putting it in there, but is it Assad or is Piazzolla the composer, or do we have the names of the 2 songs? And then when you bring up the score itself, it has the name of a song, which is completely different. So here's the example with Grace. So We don't want that at the bottom of the first page of the music. And we have a zip file titled Two Songs Piazzolla, but they're arranged by Clarice Assad and known to us as the Assad pieces or the Assad arrangements, and have individual file titles as this kind of gobbledygook. And then you can see there are just inconsistencies. You can look at it and figure it out. Not a problem for a one-on-one interaction, but when we're looking at this in terms of how we do things with larger data, it becomes very problematic very quickly. And they're just not really structured with metadata uses in mind. They don't usually, file names don't usually include the composer and the title, and the parts may or may not relate to the title of the main file. So the parts may just be named Guitar 1, like, thanks. And sometimes there's no title page, no text at all on the score, just notes, just music. So that complicates things for cataloging as well as for creation of a provisional bib record by acquisition staff. Our acquisition staff are all great, but they don't have a background in music, so we do the best we can, but we're trying to resolve some of these issues as we go along. So, may not have any knowledge of music or of licensing, but they need to put a baby bib record together before it can be placed, a provisional record, and they are also the first point of contact with the composer or vendor in our system. We are also fortunate enough to have a separate e-resources unit, and they have great experience negotiating licenses and licensing agreements, but sometimes we forget to bring them into the conversation just because of how we think about these materials. It's very, a very immediate problem. We're not thinking about it in the broader scope. And catalogers. So, and this is how I got involved in all of this. I have knowledge and understanding of all parts of this process, and certainly a vested interest in the outcome, because I can't really get my cataloging work done until all of these other issues are resolved. So, basically, to figure out to get what we want, we had to figure out what we actually need first. So we need a streamlined, consistent process, which means for us anyway, at this point, not catering to the individual needs or requests from patrons. And we had to start with our end goal and work backwards. For us, this meant deciding that we need to print the scores. And then, once we'd made that decision, the other language and treatment choices became a little clearer. And sometimes the vendor includes language, sometimes they don't, licensing language. If they do, we negotiate to make sure our needs are met. And if they don't, we get them to add language that we provide directly to the invoice or as an attachment that they add in there as an addendum. And an action checklist. So just the essentials. For us, this boiled down to, and this is a slick oversimplification, but bear with me. Can we print it? This is essential for us given our limited ability to circulate standalone digital resources. Can we lend it? Can we do the things a library does with resources? Lend to authorized users, to faculty, staff, student, walk-in users, community users, and to a certain extent to an unlimited number of users, a limited number of users, restricted. We need to know how that's going to work. Can we lend them out through ILL? Can we name it? Some composer vendors have included language that could be interpreted to restrict our ability to amend the file names to include information that would allow the files and each subfile, parts, and etc. to be identified out of context. We may also want or need to add a title page to the file, as sometimes the only title information or composer information is in the file name itself, and sometimes not even that much. And finally, can we mend it? Can we reprint it if it's lost or damaged in whole or in part, or if a part goes missing, or do we need to purchase a replacement copy? This isn't a deal breaker for us, but we want to know ahead of time so we can record that information with the order. And so we've come up with a vague boilerplate statement that it can be more effective to use the vague language to assert our rights without complicating things unnecessarily. Our experience has shown that being overly specific can be confusing. So we simply say, nothing in this agreement shall be interpreted to diminish the rights and privileges of the licensee or its authorized users with respect to any of the licensed content, including exceptions or limitations to the exclusive rights of copyright owners under the U.S. Copyright Act. So, that is broad, but also says that, we're going to do what we are allowed to do under copyright law, but we're not going to explain to you what that is. And we may reassess this approach at some time in the future, but it's similar to the contract language that we use for other resource types. So, takeaways. Some of the things we've learned. Most composer, vendors, publishers don't really understand how the library wants to use their materials. Their model is more often geared towards selling multiple copies to colleges and high schools for ensemble performance. And most composer, publisher, vendors don't understand how licensing works. Their bottom line is understandably trying to prevent loss of revenue through illegal copying and distribution of their materials. And copyright, licensing, performance rights can all get blurred together. We have tried to just say we are not particularly interested in performance rights, that is another argument altogether. And so far, that has not been problematic. And composer, publisher, vendors are also on this learning curve with us. And this is really an advocacy opportunity for us. One vendor came right out and said, we really don't understand the library model and we don't have time or staff to figure this out. Do you have language that we could use? Like, sure, of course we do. And they now incorporate our language. So that's great. And this is a great opportunity for outreach and advocacy. And I'm working on a research proposal broadly to prepare educational materials for self-publishing composers and the smaller aggregate publishers that cater to them. I think that this kind of outreach to this type of publisher, they understand what libraries need and want to demonstrate what expertise we can offer to them, is only going to improve the situation for everyone. And I welcome your feedback on that. And if anybody's interested in collaboration, give me a jingle. Other things we've learned, some parts of our digital scores intake process just don't work all that well. And we still have plenty of unresolved issues. But we have to work through them anyway, and for the time being, live with the limitations of what we have. And that is uncomfortable. But as we are learning to embrace the ambiguous future and accept unresolved issues, as that seems to be a hallmark of our current time, we're just going to roll with it. So we don't know all the answers, but we'll figure it out by doing it and get better as we go along. So that's all I have for you, and I believe we did pretty well and have some time for questions.
Thank you, Kristi. That was great. I actually would like to be a part of whatever projects you're working on because we are dealing with a similar thing at
Great.
Stanford right now. All right. You are sharing your screen, so I see a bunch of people on screen.
Yeah, so I have 3 screens of different sizes.
Yeah, I understand. But I can stop your sharing. Here we go.
Okay. Thank
so
you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, which I will read out. First question is, what have you done to educate the users who ask for these materials in the first place?
Well, we have, spoken to them about their options in purchasing and told them that, this is not a performance right agreement, just like any other score in the library. And let's see. Yeah, but I mean, it's been pretty minimal. I mean, it's been this is our first kind of, I mean, even though we've been doing it for two years, I feel like the last year is kind of its own thing. We've been asking them about, where did they hear about the scores, what, trying to get information from them as well. So it's been a little reciprocal education.
All right. Let's see, next question. How do you typically provide access to these types of scores? And I think it goes along with the next one. You said you circulate printed copies. Where do you, oh wait, we can go on to that one later. Let's talk about access.
So at this point, we print them, bind them, and that's how that is. Again, this may not be what we want to do going forward. We have, it makes most sense to print them for us at this time, but where do we print them? At what point in the workflow? Our preservation unit has the equipment, but not the staff time. Chuck Peters has shared his model where they send the files directly to the bindery and they print them and bind them, which, I think we're gonna try that, but it's with the COVID shutdown, this has just gotten unbelievably complicated. But that's what we do right now. Right. But we still have the question hanging out there, if in the future we have a way to circulate PDFs, is that what we want to do? I mean, that doesn't make any of the issues with the really gross lack of information or lack of accurate or consistent information go away. I mean, that, there would still at this point need to be some kind of intervention.
All right, thanks. Next, well, this is a question from Chuck. So you said you circulate print copies. Where do you keep the digital files, and do you intend to make those available to patrons someday?
Well, right now they're in a Google Drive, so not the world endorsed long-term storage plan by anybody, but yeah, we don't have a great answer to that. And as I said, we don't have the option of circulating those, but I like to think that we will be able to at some point. But yeah, that'll be another conversation.
Okay, I'm going to skip one question and then we'll come back. But if you had an opportunity for digital lending, would you prefer that to printing or printing/binding? And have you had any feedback from users when they find out that you're printing the scores?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, there's a lot of composers have a lot of, there's a breadth to how they feel about having their work manipulated. I mean, if I were an end user, I would love to be able to manipulate a digital score to meet my needs. And, you know, if I wanted it to fit on a page differently or work with my software, whatever. But, you know, that's going to be another level of, you know, many, many questions involved, and it won't be the same for each composer. Feedback from users, I mean, not really. Sometimes things have to, you know, that's the other thing is we have our standard print paper size, and digital scores are not held by those constraints. So we have things that, you know, I think really work better digitally, and people can zoom in or zoom out or whatever. But, you know, they print, and you have to make it so tiny for it to fit on even large paper. That's a drawback.
Yeah. I'm going to move back and go back to the question I skipped. Have you had any instances where access to the score was password protected? And if so, where did you end up putting it?
We have had instances where, I mean, and 2 instances where the publisher would not agree to our requests. And in those cases, we ended up not purchasing the items. Unfortunately.
All right. Yeah, I think you have to work with what they're willing to do.
Right.
And unfortunately, you say, well,
we can't win every battle.
Yeah. Here's a question. Have any scores come through with auxiliary types of things? For example, tape in quotes, or video components? And if so, how have you handled that?
You know, part of my brain is now like running away and hiding behind a tree. I'm like, no, I haven't encountered that. Certainly have encountered things with multiple parts, and, you know, something that if it were in print form, I would just want to chuck it all in a portfolio and say, okay, you know, you sort it out. But, you know, that's not how that works. But yeah, that's, you know, we're just doing the best we can and trying to keep some details about what comes through.
Yeah. It's 11 o'clock. So there's a couple more questions here, and I think I'm just going to have to stop the Q&A right now in order to keep us on time. So if the questions who have been skipped, could you just contact Kristi, email her, or maybe find her in the Gather session later today? But I want to keep our breaks and everything on time. So we're going to a 15-minute break at this point. And when you return, thank you, Kristi. Let me say that first. Thank you, Kristi. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Keith, for the presentations. They're great. I'm going to stop the recording before I forget to do this.